Yes, thank you for inviting me here to speak about this site. I spent the whole of 2006 in the East Kirk of St Nicholas carrying out this excavation. I'm going to try in an hour to summarise what we found. The Kirk of St Nicholas were wanting to redevelop what is called the East Kirk, which is about half of the Church of St Nicholas in Aberdeen. They have put over the East Kirk to a trust, a non-religious trust, and they are going to have a development of space for various art forms in the upstairs, so ballet, conferences, exhibitions. They're going to have a cafe with facilities for training people to cook and to be independent and live away from home. And then in the basement area, they were going to have meeting rooms, places that can be hired out to make income. And so it was this area in which the excavation really was involved. And the Kirk of St Nicholas, very briefly, its history is that the West Kirk is completely separate from this development. So when I'm talking about the church, I'm really only talking about the East Kirk. And the West Kirk, which you can see here, built in the 1750s, the transept here is a sort of dividing area between the two kirks. And then the East Kirk, you can see here, this is actually the 15th century church still standing in 1822. And then this was demolished in 1837 to make way for a better, bigger East Kirk. And then it was burnt down in the 1870s. This is a picture of the 1874 fire, which started in the steeple area. And at the time, the newspapers said the East Kirk was completely demolished by fire. But when we were digging, we initially found on virtually the first day of the dig that the walls inside the church, once the materials had been stripped off the inner walls, that the walls were charred. And so historical research into that 1874 fire actually showed that although the steeple did collapse into the East Kirk, the walls remained standing, and that in fact the 1874 1830s and then 1870s walls, so the 19th century church, was actually built onto the 15th century church. So this is the 1874 fire, but underneath that we found the 15th century choir wall, so that what they had done in 1837 was to take down the 15th century church, but to use really the walls and the foundations of the 15th century church as a foundation for the 19th century church. And here you can see you can see the charring and the blackening on the wall here, and then you can see this step, and this is the 15th century church wall. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but that was a sort of introduction just very briefly to the history of this part of the church itself, and obviously I'll be going into a bit more detail about what we found on the excavation. Essentially, the 15th century church was on the same ground plan as the standing church which is there today. And the area of the excavation that we were involved in excavating was an area of 20 by 20 in size, and we were to go down 4 metres. And so within that we found very substantial structural remains which actually had to be demolished as part of this project. So these are the two of the sleeper walls, the foundation walls under the pillars of the 15th century church. And this is a drawing of the 15th century church, which was undertaken in the early 19th century before this church was demolished. And you can see here the pillars or piers, and the walls underneath here were the ones that we found on the excavation. Now this is a picture just to show you what the dig looked like. So at the time we were doing the dig in 2006, as I said, I was there for the whole year doing the excavation, and you can see the size of the dig. These are the two sleeper walls here, and again you can see the outside walls of the 19th century church. The excavation, it took the whole year to carry out this dig. It involved over 80 staff altogether, including a core of 30 archaeologists, full-time, professional archaeologists, plus a number of archaeology students, a small number of school children, and a small number of volunteers, several of whom, well, one of whom is certainly in the room tonight, but many who have been on other excavations with me. We have just wanted to point out that we have a conveyor belt here for taking the soil away from the site, because 1,600 cubic metres of soil is quite a substantial amount to remove through a small door of the church. And so what we did was we had the conveyor belt went out of the window at the east of the church and down a chute and into a skip, which was replaced every day. And then just very briefly, just to show you that this gallery around the East Kirk actually allowed people to come and visit the dig. So we had over 14,000 people visited the dig in 2006. Now some of those were people who came regularly, you know, people would come once a week to see what we found. What we had 70 school classes and quite a number of other people could watch us through this little window here to see the progress of the dig. So the 15th century church, as I said, it was on the footprint of the 19th century church, and these big sleeper walls, these very, very substantial structural remains that we obviously found on the excavation. This is really to show you how they sort of fit in with each other. That this is the transept that I pointed out on the slide, which is not involved in the excavation, and is a sort of division between the West Kirk and the East Kirk. These two big sleeper walls, and then this area called St Mary's Chapel here is also a small medieval chapel that again was redeveloped in the 19th century, and this is at a lower level to the area of the East Kirk. So they're actually on a slope downwards towards the east, which is this way here. So our dig was sort of almost on two levels, in the sense that we were digging out this area here down to meet the ground floor here, and to allow people to enter the new development through here and into the area that we'd excavated. So that's the sort of plan of the 15th century church. We have a series of stairs here which would have taken us between those two levels in the medieval period, and also windows and doors in the 15th century church. So we have here, these are not particularly good for us. I'm going to show you again just some of those different aspects of the structural remains. Some of these things are incredibly difficult to photograph. For example, on the south wall there was actually a construction corridor, and this is in discussions with Richard Fawcett, who came up several times to the dig. We looked at various aspects of the architectural remains, which of course were very complex, and we had noted that the floor, there was a mortar floor running downwards towards the east, so down this level that I taught, these two different levels. And he's suggesting that this was what he would call a construction corridor, which would have allowed people to move materials from the two different levels in the medieval period down a corridor. But this was incredibly difficult to photograph because you can imagine, for health and safety reasons, we had to have a lot of pillars built in. So these are new steel beams that were put in. You can see our walkways that we had. So some of these larger elements were very, very difficult to photograph. But that construction corridor was very, very unusual, apparently. And yet to find many excavated examples of something like that. The doors, which would have taken you, when you went down the stairs or the construction corridor, would have taken you into St Mary's, were 15th century granite, so some of the very earliest granite working, and quite a number of masons' marks were recorded. This star is recorded all over the stones of these doors, and I know some of you will know the problems with masons' marks in the sense of actually being able to allocate them to different masons, but we have names of some of the masons who were involved obviously in the construction of this 15th century church. I show you this view because of course the 15th century church is cut through an earlier graveyard, which I'll show you about in a minute. This lovely little set of stairs, we actually broke into this little vault. They knew that there were stairs there, but they hadn't been seen for many, many years. And so they got rather covered in debris, and large bits of stonework had been put in there. But we think it's very likely that the top of the stairs was blocked off at the Reformation, and so that's the brick blocking that probably dates to the Reformation, when the church was divided up into different areas. And so this plan shows you that division, that at the Reformation the doors between the two areas went out of use and the window was blocked, and also the stairs blocked. And again, historical research says that after the Reformation the Kirks were divided, the West Kirk from the East Kirk, and also from St Mary's, so into really three separate churches. And so we have archaeological evidence for the blocking of these windows and doors, but also this wall which was constructed in 1596, and again we have documentary reference to that wall, which then partitioned off the East Kirk from the West Kirk with this very substantial wall. And after the Reformation, we know that wooden galleries were built onto the north side of the church, because we found several bases for this wooden structure. Several areas where up to 12 gravestones were stacked on top of each other. Unfortunately, no remains of the wooden structure itself, but because a huge amount of grave digging had taken place in the area. But 3 stacks in a row suggested that there had been a wooden gallery along the side of the church. And that's something that the historical research is not complete for this site. So that's one thing that we will be doing more work onto, looking at these galleries, because we could probably find out when they were built and who built them. And just to show you one of the gravestones, when we were dismantling these stacks of gravestones, of course a lot of them were reused, and so we had fantastic inscriptions and different names. This is just one of the most interesting, which is when we turned it over, we could see it says A.N. Melville, Master of Music, and then several dates, and it's been re-inscribed a couple of times. But essentially we have historical reference for the death of Andrew Melville, who was the Master of Music in the Song School in Aberdeen in 1640, and so this is his gravestone, which was then reused in the post-Reformation period, well after 1640 obviously, to when a gallery was built in the church. And we had a lot of masons pieces, so stonework and other masonry to do with the 15th century church, which of course a lot of it collapsed into the church and just been left. So small pillars, decorative portions of stone. This lovely face had been used, the stone had just been rebuilt into a wall that we had to dismantle as part of the project. So we have about 2,000 pieces of stonework, and again this post-excavation is not complete for various reasons, and the stone is one of the things that we have not finished looking at. But Richard Fawcett has looked at it and thrown his hands up in the air with delight at the quality and slight horror at the quantity, of course, of the remains. But that's something that we'll be working through over the next few years to get all that looked at, dated obviously, and then published. And again, all the glass, huge quantities of different glass from different periods. There's still some quite old glass in the Kirk itself, but lots and lots of different periods of stained glass from the 15th century church. And lots of plaster and other elements of the church. So again, when that post-excavation is complete, we'll have quite a good picture of what the 15th century church looked like. A little fragment of a bell. I mean, we had thousands of small finds, again, which we haven't been able to go through every one of them thoroughly yet, but this fragment of copper alloy bell, and St Nicholas has got one of I think it's the largest carillon in Britain, with 48 bells, and it's always had a very well-known set of bells, and of course they're mentioned in a lot of documents. So it was rather nice to find this little fragment of one of the copper alloy bells. And one of the things that we found, I've mentioned gravestones, but quite often we found that they were using gravestones to make almost areas of paving or areas of flooring, under which there were a group of burials. So for example, this group of 3 gravestones, under that are 6 individuals who have been buried, presumably from the same family. And we of course don't know if this is a 1679 and 1689 I think a couple have been commemorated on this gravestone, but of course we don't know if that's actually the people that we excavated underneath, because we don't know the identity of any of the individuals that we excavated, because there are no burial records from the medieval period, and so at the moment we don't have any names of any of the individuals. We excavated nearly 1,000 burials altogether from the earliest period, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, up to the latest ones, which were very late 17th or early 18th century. These later burials were very, very well preserved. Coffins, coffin fittings, unfortunately no nameplates and no dates. We were just a little bit too early for that. I think if they'd gone on another 50 years we might have had a nameplate or a date. The coffins were so well preserved in some cases that although when you dismantled them they were very crumbly, you could look at the way that the coffins had been constructed. So the tongue and groove jointing of the base portion of the coffin, and then long planks used for the side and short planks for each of the ends. Some of the coffins had strengtheners on the corners, and some of them had 1 or 2 sets of iron handles. In some of the coffins we found that they'd been whitewashed inside, and again this is something that is known from these sort of later burials. We also found evidence of material inside, so things like sawdust, which had seemed to have been put round the body prior to it being laid in the coffin. And so quite a lot of different elements within the coffins themselves. We found rope. Here, I've just pointed that out because that's was a little difficult to photograph, but several examples where rope appeared to have been either thrown into the once the coffin had been lowered, or actually broken. And again, that hasn't been analysed yet, but it seemed to be very fine rope that they were using, so maybe not surprising therefore that they had breakages regularly as they lowered the coffin into the grave. And quite a lot of things in with the individuals. We found, I don't know how to say this exactly, but we don't find many coins on digs in Aberdeen. And so partly that's to do with the very acidic soils in Aberdeen, I have to say. But we did find over 80 coins within burials in this, within the coffins from the 15th century to the early 18th century. And so I'm just pointing out some here. Most of them were between the sort of chest and the pelvic area, so had been placed underneath the coffin lid, in with the burial, the individual themselves. But one coffin, which was a part of a group of 6 individuals who had been buried in one family burial group, 5 adults and 1 child. This adult had actually 4 coins had been thrown onto the lid of the coffin. And so there's one here, one here, one here. And this is just a little detail showing them. And they'd actually corroded onto the lid. Now, that lid had then collapsed, but they had already become corroded on. And these coins were dated to 2 to the 1630s and 2 to the 1690s. So they are evidence of our latest burial. I obviously at this point want to point out, of course, that at the Reformation in 1560, there were supposed to be no burials within churches, but we have maybe a couple of hundred who were buried after that period, we think. Some of the burials, it was a bit difficult to date, but around about that many were actually buried after the Reformation. And this, of course, was families who already had purchased an area of the church, who maybe had already buried one individual and wanted to continue burying the other members of their family. So, but very, very good dating evidence for a lot of these burials. Also a lot of textiles in with the individuals. Now, no complete items apart from a number of hats. You can see here a very well preserved hat with a central button and radiating ribbon. And again, we haven't had these analysed yet. This is part of the ongoing post-excavation process, but these actually haven't been looked at, unfortunately, yet. But there are several different styles. You can see a slightly different one here, almost like a leathery material, but also quite a number of others that weren't as well preserved as that. But also elements of the clothing. So we didn't find any complete garments, as such, but we found a lot of decorative elements. This is incredibly difficult to see because it's brown material on brown soil. But there's a bow here. This is the shin here, so the knee, the ankle, and there's a bow here, tied here, and one tied here just below the knees, suggesting sort of knickerbocker-style garment. But also we found quite a lot of trim sort of round the ankles, round the wrists, and in other places, and also bows of sort of silk ribbon decorating various garments. And also a few small finds in with the burials themselves. And this was a particularly interesting find. This is a middle-aged female who had very severe osteomalacia, vitamin D deficiency, and she had obviously been ill for a very long time, and she was buried with this little copper alloy token, which is an image, well, a pietà, which is the Virgin Mary with the body of Jesus over her knee. Now this is a well-known image, but so far we haven't been able to find a parallel for this as a possible pilgrimage token. It's obviously been broken, not during the excavation, I hope, but it was buried underneath her pelvis, and so she'd obviously been carrying it or wanted to be buried with it. And again, we have a lot more work to do on this, to look to find out where she had maybe visited, maybe been on a pilgrimage, but so far we haven't been able to find or link this to a particular church. And also, well, this is just a nice little interesting one. There's a little gunflint here, which is again on the pelvis of an individual. Maybe it had been in a little bag or in an item of clothing. So a small number of items like that found in with these later burials. And obviously also clothing fasteners. So this lovely little copper heart-shaped brooch here over this heart of this man. And of course quite a number of leg and arm positions. Now archaeologists can talk a lot about this sort of, what it all means, but really I just wanted to show you a couple. The legs, we had quite a number of different, including actually crossed ankles, but this is quite a nice one where we had the arms here up in a sort of praying or clasping position, and we had wondered when we excavated the fingers if there might be anything in that grasp, but unfortunately nothing, but rather nice sort of arm position there. But the most unusual position, and I haven't satisfactorily explained this yet, but then you may have suggestions in question time. This is a middle-aged man who is lying face down. He is got one of his arms behind his back and one in front. So he's lying, I don't know if I want to demonstrate this, but one in front and one of his arms behind. Now there was no evidence of anything tying the hands together. You can see here the arm over the back, and then there's two sets of fingers here that are all together. There's been suggestions that maybe his coffin got turned over in transit into the church, that occasionally you do hear about an accident where a coffin falls off a cart and it gets turned upside down. But the sort of neat way that those arms are together, I'm not really sure. But apart from that, he was buried obviously in a very expensive location close to the high altar, in the East Kirk. So his family paid an awful lot of money at the time for him to be buried there. He was the most unusual position we had. Most people were buried in a very traditional way. And quite a lot of objects in with the soil, rather than on the individuals themselves. Thousands of little pins. This is quite a nice one on the left, which has had lots of little beads on it, and a little sort of Luckenbooth little portion of a brooch here. But again, sort of thousands of small finds. Far too many really to go into any detail today. But other little things like book fittings. Again, lots and lots of little copper alloy fittings, bosses. This lovely little key here, a little copper alloy key, and we found several of those on the excavation. And so that's the 15th century church, which was demolished in the early 19th century. But when, of course, we were digging down, we were obviously dismantling the 15th century church, creating this open space for this, this new trust. And we found that in the 15th century they'd actually left a lot of earlier remains in situ. So in fact we had at least 3 earlier medieval churches in the 15th century. And that's because instead of dismantling everything in the 15th century, they actually just dug away small areas and built into the earlier structures. So here you've got the wall of what we later found out was a late 12th century church. And what they've done is they've just cut through that to create these pillar bases, these pier bases, and literally used the 12th century church as sort of foundations for the 15th century church. So we were incredibly lucky that things had just not been swept aside. And in fact they brought material in the 15th century to level up the ground. So you'll see in a minute when I show you the 12th century churches, how well preserved they actually were. So what we have in summary is we have a later 12th century church in yellow here, which actually replaced an early to mid 12th century church in green. Now we think that for some reason this wall became unstable and had to be replaced because it's only got a gap of 40 centimetres in between it. So possibly because the ground slopes away very steeply at that point, it may be that that wall wasn't built very well in the first place and they had to replace it. So you've got middle 12th century, later 12th century. I'm going to come on to the little blue structure in a minute, of course. And so I'll just run through showing you a few pictures of these structures. So later 12th century, pilaster buttress here, and east end of the late 12th century church. So we have the full outline of that east church, including going along to the end. The buttresses were rather less well preserved at that end, but you could see where they had been. The east wall still standing 3 courses high. And here's some details of the buttresses just to show you how well preserved these are. Inside, still standing a few courses high, and including whitewash on the wall, which is, for some reason when that's been put in, it's dripped down onto the floor here. Not very well applied, I have to say. And the corner here, again, this is the corner of the later, inside of the later 12th century church. And you can see how it's sitting in the, this is the later church, you can see how it's sort of sitting within that. So since the 15th century, all of these structures and layers I'm talking about from now on have been inside, which is one of the reasons that they were actually quite well preserved, because they were in a sort of a dry, sandy soil. And again, just a detail of that, the still standing that high inside the late 12th century. You can see it's been cut through. There's a big cut here where a later burial has gone in, but still incredibly well preserved. And again, lots of stonework from the 12th century church. And again, this is just to prove that Richard came to the site. And so he was, as I said, obviously very interested in the range of stonework that we had from these phases. And again, a small amount of other structural remains, various tiny pieces of window glass, fairly poorly preserved. On the 12th century church, a structure had been built onto the north of that, and we had these 2 walls, which had then been cut through in the 15th century. So at some point, probably in the 12th century, this building had been built onto the north side of the church, which we wondered if it might have been a sacristy. There's historical references to a sacristy being built on the north side, and so we think that this is likely to be the location of it. Again, very, very difficult to photograph in a whole because of all the lights. You can see the individual lights people had to work with, and obviously all the steel work. But essentially, this is the north wall of the 12th century church, and the sacristy walls coming out here, then cut by the later wall. So, but inside the sacristy, very, very well preserved, floor layers, structural remains, and a lot of finds just from that in that small area. So large numbers of pieces of copper alloy, different items like chain, possibly horse harness, quite a number of different pieces of bone. These are some of the nice pieces, a little whistle, lovely little barbed bone pin here, and other elements. And also a huge amount of pottery. Now, most of the pottery, of course, we had on the site has been moved around many times, but a really nice selection of sort of 12th to 13th century pottery from this area that we call the sacristy. And it's possible that actually the sacristy building went out of use as a sacristy, and possibly was maybe something more domestic, because a lot of the pottery is cooking pots and jugs and sort of more domestic wares. And the burials from the 12th century, about half of the burials that we had excavated date to the earlier period, pre-15th century. And a small number of them were in things like sarcophagus. This is Dunfermline, just to show this is part of a sarcophagus here. And we had several bits of lids of stone coffins. But most of the burials were just in shrouds, no evidence of coffins. This is showing you the east wall of the East Kirk, and this is the graveyard outside and the 15th century wall. So you can see these survive in that gap between the east wall of the 12th century church and where they put the 15th century church. Interestingly, you can see here that a lot of the feet bones are missing, because when they cut a trench along here, we think when the 15th century wall was built, they took all the feet away of those individuals, but left, well, there was about 3 layers, you know, 3 different layers of individuals who all wanted to be buried with their head next to the outside of the east wall. And quite a number of people buried in particular places like round about the buttresses, and this is one of the buttresses on the south side, and again quite a group of very closely buried individuals next to these buttresses. But also quite a number of very deep burials, and at that time within the church we had a group of very deep but not intercutting burials, so burials that had been marked and were not really intercutting each other. Very well preserved bone. And not many finds within the actual, with the actual burials, but a number who had presumably been on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. So 4 scallop shells were excavated. We have 2 here next to the head of an individual. Presumably they had been on a hat. Here one not found in a burial, but just showing you the detail of the 2 piercings there through the scallop shell. And this rather nice little scallop shell here, which was over the pelvis of the individual, presumably it had been on a scrip or a bag that obviously then rotted away. And then just to show you here, very, very slight traces of wood alongside a small number of individuals that were maybe remains of a staff. And here you can see, just to illustrate the staff and the scallops on the hat there. Obviously very, very interesting for us to be able to link, St Nicholas. People had gone on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Not a huge number of burials from Scotland that have been excavated with scallop shells. And so I said that there had been a sort of early to mid 12th century church which had then collapsed. And so we're starting to, as we were excavating, starting to find evidence of these earlier walls and the sort of relation as we were picking the site apart and finding the evidence of these earlier walls here. And so, again, just using this plan, the sort of early to mid 12th century wall here, and underneath this later wall here, a stone coffin. We didn't have many which had actually been constructed in situ, in the sense of a hole being dug and stones being mortared in here. Unfortunately, when they built this walling then in the late 12th century, they'd actually taken the individual, the burial out, and had disturbed it. But it may actually relate to this very early church or to the sort of mid 12th century church. And so that's a sort of summary of what we were finding. And really just to show you now before I talk about the sort of earliest period, that the sort of pinky colour here is the 15th century church. And so within that you can see the pillar bases that I talked about that had cut away the earlier church. We've got the later 12th century structure in yellow here, and then in green the mid 12th century church. But this little blue, which I haven't really highlighted yet, is the earliest structure that we found on the site. And St Nicholas Church are very pleased that they think this is the earliest wall standing in Aberdeen at the moment, because as part of the dig we found this little apsidal end of a church which might be 11th to very, very early 12th century. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of that now. This is the inside of it, showing you one mortar floor that had been put down. You can see again later burials cutting through it, but you can see that very small number of layers associated with the inside of that church, because it presumably went out of use very, very quickly and then was truncated and enclosed under the floor of these rectangular 12th century churches. But you can see here from the outside, you can see the circular apse here. But most interestingly, very interestingly, we found 25, the burials of 25 small children almost radiating out from this wall. And you can see here some of the burials. I'm going to show you details of pictures of these individuals. This is a plan showing the burials. And you can see how they appear to radiate out from this outside wall. Apart from in this corner here where they go much more sort of east-west, or not really on a good alignment, but they are associated with this little apsidal wall. And some of the burials were in little stone coffins. This is one which again had been mortared in, so had been built into a hole, and the stones mortared together like a little kist. If you ignore the stone at the top there, which is actually a later stone structure, most of the individuals were between about 6 months and 3 years. Some were in other sort of stone, more unstructured stone coffins, so stone round the side, headstone, some pillow stones, and this one had stones roughly put over the top of it. But also some were in wooden log coffins. This one was preserved very well because the wood had actually been burnt, and so there was wood underneath the burial. And we had, when we were doing the dig, we decided that we would send off a sample of this, actually during the dig, and it came back to the 10th to early 11th century as a date. Now, we don't actually think that the burials are quite that early, but unfortunately, when we sent off bone of this individual, we haven't been able to get a very accurate date yet because this child ate 40% fish in their diet, and that at the moment hasn't allowed us to get a better radiocarbon date than possibly sort of late 11th to early 12th century. So we think we're in that sort of late 11th to early 12th century period. And associated with some of these burials, we also had quite a lot of quite early pottery, East Anglian, Low Country pottery. We think that the Aberdeen pottery industry started around about in the 13th century sometime, and so this has interested some of the pottery specialists. This nice little collection of very early pottery. But other log burials, this is one, the log has actually been hollowed out and the wood very, very poorly preserved, but just the sort of almost a stain of the wood, hollowed out log surviving. And some of the burials appear to have been marked, so we had some upstanding stones associated with the burials. You can also see the stone around the burials. We had pillow and sort of cheek stones surrounding some of these children's burials. But also 2 areas where mussel shells had been placed over a burial. And each of the mussel shells had been put open side down, split in half and put open side down. And again, there are parallels to that, to shells marking burials. And other interesting burials probably associated with this phase. Again, just hopefully you're familiar with this plan now, but cut by this mid-12th century wall, we have these 2 burials marked in the black there, and they were presumably associated with this apsidal church, but it's been estimated 40 years of these burials taking place, this wall was built. And so, because the bodies weren't completely decomposed, they had actually still had, the bones were still attached together with tendons. And so instead of actually removing the bodies, they actually concertinaed the bodies into the small space away from the wall. So they dug the trench, they found the body, and then they concertinaed the body up into this little space above the head. So when we were excavating, this is the wall, when we were excavating, we found the feet and the legs, the knees, the pelvis, the chest, sort of concertinaed. And then the skull was actually in place. They hadn't moved the skull. It was still in place. And it actually, one of these individuals had a copper alloy chain with a little lead cross around the neck, still in situ in its position. And this is the only cross that we have from the whole site from any period. And obviously a very, very early find. And again, it's been a conservation, but not been analysed in any way yet. So we're still waiting for results about that. And some of these earlier burials also had textiles because they were so deeply dug into the natural sort of clay material. They actually survived. Textiles survived very, very well underneath some of the bodies. And this is an example of these very coarse textiles that we've been excavating. And Before the 12th century church, or around about that period, we also had two large ditches which may be associated with the apsidal church or these very early phases. And I'm not really going to talk about them, but there is quite a lot of evidence of sort of early activity on the site. Huge ditch here, and then a smaller V-shaped ditch, which both ran north-south across the site. But also, prior to the apsidal church being built, the area had been used as an industrial area, and there were quite thick layers of ash and burning. Also evidence of fish processing, small chopped pieces of fish bone here in this layer into which everything else was cut and the apsidal church was placed, including a little bit of an antler hammer here, suggesting sort of small-scale industrial working, fish or animal bone processing, possibly small-scale industrial activity. And again, there's still a lot of work to do on the farm, the finds from these layers, but this had obviously been an area which had been heavily used even prior to the church being built. And other layers, this lovely sort of organic layer, this is it looked like a cow patch, to be honest, but quite a lot of these little organic layers surviving in the area around about the church. And the very, very earliest layer, associated with fragments of burnt bone and some flints, and unfortunately I don't have photographs of the flints, but this sort of pebbly surface which had been laid down to the east of the apsidal church and running down the slope that I talked about prior to all the churches being built. So that's a summary of what we found on the site. I want to now just talk a little bit about the human remains, which is the only portion of this excavated site which has been completely finished with. The remains, well, I've got the numbers of the individuals and the amount of bone that we excavated, have been studied by GARD, by Glasgow University, and the report's completed for that, because the church want to rebury the remains, possibly in later this year. And so we have got quite a lot of information about the analysis of the human remains themselves. So 897 individuals altogether, and you can see roughly, 478 from the earlier period and 341 from the later period, so quite substantial numbers for statistical analysis. Also 3.5 tons of disarticulated human bone, representative of 1,175 individuals. So altogether 2,073 individuals found their way into the East Kirk. Now some of those may have come in soil, to be honest, but it does represent a large, one of the largest collections of human remains excavated in Scotland. This is a wonderful wall which was put in and mortared, and all these bones have been put into the wall foundation trench, and then of course attached by the mortar to the wall. And so when we excavated down, these were actually attached onto the wall still, being attached by the mortar. And then just to show you, this is the report on the human remains, which has all been completed. Again, just briefly, roughly equal numbers of males and females, and males and possible females. Age, again, very typical of a medieval site. 25% of the individuals died when they were under 3 years of age, 50% under 15. So only 50% survived until the road of 15. And then, of course, only 3% were older adults, which always shocks me, over sort of 50 or so, only 3%. And more children died before the 15th century, so in the earlier periods than in the later periods. This graph is not particularly easy to see, but essentially this is the 11th to 15th century burials, and you can see more are dying than in the earlier period in the yellow line here, indicating possible better child nutrition, child health generally, and therefore less children dying. Also, people were taller after the 15th century, so essentially, and again we've got our little graph, but essentially both males and females were taller, suggesting of course better nutrition, better health generally, which allows you then obviously to attain greater height. I mean, I mentioned already family burial areas, but we haven't actually had things like DNA analysis or anything done on any of the individuals yet, but we're hoping that we will, over the next few years, do various tests on the skeletons. But this is just to show you, for example, in relationships here, that you have the coffin of a middle-aged man, and just above him here you have the burial of an older female. So very likely that these individuals are buried. These were just two buried together. Very likely that this is a husband and a wife buried in the same plot. And on to just very briefly talk about some of the diseases. Again, because we had such a large collection of skeletons, we've been able to do statistics on the individuals. And so, looking at, for example, arthritis, they've been able to see, obviously, how many people had arthritis of the spine, and we certainly noticed that on the dig, that when we were excavating, a large number of people their spines seemed to be quite badly affected by arthritis. This was actually, I excavated this individual who had incredibly bad arthritis of the knees, and of course I sympathise. Being a field archaeologist, the arthritis of the knees is something that you have to deal with. But you can see here how they've been able to obviously divide it up, and quite a number of individuals with quite severe osteoarthritis, and a much higher instance in younger adults than, of course, today. And I think that would be expected, where we know that people had to do much harder physical work, and so would be much more prone to osteoarthritis. Quite a lot of infection, and again quite severe infection. Again, we know that things like falling from height would cause quite severe broken legs. So we had quite a number of those, some of them leading actually to osteomyelitis, of course, when infection gets into the bone. But this is a very nasty case where this person has had a broken lower leg. Unfortunately, their feet and all their upper body had gone, cut by later burials. But you can see quite a normal knee and lower leg here. And then you can see the infected one here, where infection has essentially fused all this into one bone and has fused all the ankle bones together. And so quite a number of cases of this where quite severe infection has, not just in individual bones, sometimes over quite a lot of the body. One interesting thing is that sinusitis, although there are not a huge number of cases, there were quite a lot more in the pre-15th century period. Now, obviously with sinusitis, the sinus has to be broken to see, unless you go in with a little endoscope, and so we obviously couldn't see it for all of the individuals, but the ones that were broken and they could see, you can see the pitting inside the sinus. There are quite a lot more individuals before the 15th century. And one of the reasons for this, and this has been seen on other sites, is that ventilation in buildings was far better after the 15th century. In Aberdeen, we know that a lot more people building in stone from the 15th century, and so they wouldn't have had a central hearth, which would have allowed smoke into the room, causing things like breathing problems and sinusitis. So this is possibly some evidence for that. We also had quite a number of other diseases. I mean, this is just one case of, we had one severe case of syphilis. This is a young man, in his late teens to very early 20s, who had a very severe case. You can see the lesions on the skull, and we've also had lesions on the legs and the arms. But also a small number of congenital syphilis passed on from the mother into children as well. So a small number of individuals with that. Lots of fractures, of course, as you would expect, and again, ribs and spines and arms, quite badly affected. A little bit more males than females, but of course quite different bones being broken in the medieval period than today, because of the different sorts of accidents that people were having. A lot more things like falling from height in the medieval period, where we don't have so much of that with our health and safety and our scaffolding and things like that. But one thing we had several cases of were head wounds and things like sharp and blunt force trauma. This is two of the evidence of blunt force trauma here, one on the back of the head here, and this one on the top of the head here. Neither of these, of course, fatal, but also quite a number of fatal ones, including this. This is the back of the knee here, so the femur here. And this is one of the osteoarchaeologists in Glasgow demonstrating with a ruler how this had happened. And this is the back of the leg, possibly somebody running away, moving away, and got sliced with a sword down the back of the leg, just above the knee. But also quite a number to the head, the one behind here, behind the ear, on the top of the head, and a couple of blunt force, like with a mace or something like that, on the tops of the head. But the worst case we had was this individual who had 5 fatal blade wounds to his head, and 1 non-fatal one. He had a little nick on the top of his head here, which was not fatal. But then somebody came and slashed the back of his head here, the side of his head, the side of his head here. And the worst one, which is when they put a sword and took away all of his top teeth here. And this is, if I had a chance to do a reconstruction of a face, this is the one that I would do, because this is him. He's obviously been in the wars prior to this incident, because he's got, well, apart from him being very muscly, he's got quite a number of old injuries as well. But he has a rather characterful face, I think. A lot of cases of rickets, of course, but mostly in children. It appears that by adulthood most people were better fed and better, getting more sun. And so most of the cases were children, apart from the individual I told you about before, who had this case of adult rickets, which was just maybe part of another condition and didn't heal. But also a lot of other dietary deficiencies. You would think possibly that Aberdeen, with all its fish and good access to a lot of meat, would have an incredibly good diet, but a lot of people had dietary deficiencies. Pitting on the skull here and in the orbit, suggesting iron deficiency, anemia. Scurvy, again mostly children exhibiting this pitting sign of scurvy. Things like dental hyperplasia, which are incidents in childhood, when the teeth are growing, of illness or dietary deficiency. Quite a number of cases of those, including some examples actually on the root, which is not very common at all. So as the root is developing, when the child is a tiny baby, they're actually having problems with their diet at that period. So quite a number of cases of that. But other things, of course, we have quite a number of cases of cancer, metastatic cancer, so different, sites on the ribs, on the vertebrae, several different cases on the vertebrae themselves. And spina bifida, Aberdeen has quite a prevalence of spina bifida in medieval populations, slightly more than the norm. And again, we're not exactly sure why that is, but 16 individuals from this population. And this one case of scoliosis. Now, scoliosis is the deforming of the vertebrae. So this is the vertebrae coming down here, the backbone here coming down like this. And so this woman would have been very, very stooped over. But was one very severe case of that. And quite a lot of dental disease, as you would imagine. Medieval populations have a lot of caries, a lot of abscesses, and St Nicholas was just the same as every other population, medieval population. We also had 6 pipe smokers' notches, which I rather like. Included this man at the top left here, who actually had smoked a pipe in one place for 20 years or something, and then he decided he was going to move it over and make another notch. So whether it had got too loose for his pipe, we're not sure. But of course, quite a number of pipes in with the burial layers, suggesting, of course, probably the gravediggers certainly smoked. But also this lovely little notch here in a middle-aged female from the 12th century period. And of course, that's not pipe smoker, but maybe something to do with her occupation, maybe working in leather or textiles, where she's pulling the leather or textiles between her teeth. And very small number of people who are quite vain. We have a denture here, again from quite a late individual. Unfortunately, the rest of the individual was not present. This was just a mandible, which is loose in soil. But he has a gold wire around his front teeth here. Unfortunately, the actual denture has disappeared, so we don't know if it was another person's tooth or an animal tooth or a ceramic tooth. But his teeth were incredibly poorly rotten, and so he was obviously trying to just make them look a little bit better. But this very intriguing case here, where we actually didn't notice this when we were excavating this individual, but in post-excavation we found that there's a little block, like a little die, a block of bone that had been positioned on this back tooth, and you can see how rotten the teeth are here. and how this actually brings that tooth up to a level with the other teeth. Unfortunately, we have no idea how it was kept in place, that it's possible that it was actually just put in for the burial, but we haven't been able to find a parallel to this yet. Very, very sort of unusual case. And so really that's the sort of summary of what we found on the excavation. I'll be very happy, obviously, at the end to answer questions, but one of the things that we were always very concerned about was that St Nicholas Church was not actually in the medieval borough of Aberdeen, that it was not in the area which was surrounded by the ports or gates, which were closed at times of attack or plague. And this is really just to show, this is Parson James Gordon's map, 1661, which is the earliest map we have, or the earliest detailed map we have of Aberdeen. And essentially the medieval borough goes down here and along. Now this is the green, down to up to the castle gate here, and then along to Old Aberdeen and up towards Old Aberdeen. So the little blue marks are showing the ports or gates. And marked on the friaries, because of course also the friaries, most of them are outside the borough. So the black friars, the grey friars, the white friars, the red friars. But St Nicholas Church, you can see it here, set quite way out of the ports or gates. So there's been quite a lot of speculation about the reason for this. And of course I think one of the reasons is that this was the highest point of the medieval borough, that it was on a hill, it was on a high position. And so maybe not necessarily need to be within the ports. But of course also we know now that it's much earlier in date than we had thought, because although the borough of Aberdeen really started in the 12th century, the church of course was probably there before that, or was there before that. And so it's always been slightly separate from the borough itself. So I mean, we have been able to answer a huge amount of questions. I did say that of course the post-excavation isn't complete, and so this will be an ongoing process in the next few years to complete all that post-excavation, and then obviously find out a lot more about these individuals, hopefully be able to name some of them. We'll certainly know a lot more about their clothing and their burial garments. And what's happening at the moment, and one of the reasons the post-excavation isn't complete, is that obviously with the hard financial times that we have had, the church has struggled to make the money to actually go ahead with the development. And so I'm very happy to say that they've actually started with phase 1, which is this is the East Kirk encased in scaffolding to allow it to be made wind and watertight. And this is phase 1 of the development. And they're hoping that obviously the other phases will follow shortly. And that obviously then as we get those extra phases, we will then get more of the post-excavation money. Right, I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.